Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're going to kind of dig into something I think we all struggle with a little bit, speaking smoothly without those pauses that can kind of trip us up sometimes. And you sent some really interesting material my way, exploring some techniques that can help people develop a more natural flow. I mean, whether it's learning a new language or just having a more confident conversation. So our goal is to really, pull out the key strategies from this stuff so you can start speaking with more ease and confidence.
Yeah, I think what's really key here is understanding that being a good communicator, it isn't just about having the right words, up in your brain. It's also about how those words come out and how effortless it feels when you're speaking. So the resources you've shared, they really dive into both the mechanics and the psychology behind those moments of silence, and more importantly, give us some really concrete techniques to work with.
Okay, so let's get right into it. One of the first things the material explores is why we pause when we speak. And it seems like there's a lot more to it than simply forgetting what to say.
Absolutely. The sources highlight, I think there's like 5 or 6 really common drivers. So sometimes it's simply our brain working to retrieve the perfect word or to structure the next thought and kind of a mental rummaging, if you will. Nerves, of course, play a huge role for a lot of people creating those mental roadblocks. If you're learning a new language, the extra step of translating from your native tongue can definitely lead to pauses. We all have that desire for perfection, right?
Right.
Wanting to get every single word exactly right. And paradoxically, that can lead to hesitation. And then sometimes these pauses just become ingrained habits over time, almost like a verbal pathic.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The material points out that not all pauses are created equal.
Right.
There's a difference between a helpful pause and one that really throws off your rhythm.
Precisely. This is so crucial for listeners to remember. Natural, well-placed pauses can actually be incredibly powerful. You give your listener time to absorb what you've just said. It can add emphasis to a certain point, and it even allows you a brief strategic moment to gather your thoughts. Without disrupting the flow, the problem arises with what we might call disruptive hesitations. The abins, the ums, those long anti-silences that break the continuity of your message, and as the sources point out, can really undermine your confidence in how you come across.
Right, and then that brings us to the topic of filler words, those little crutches we all know and love a little too much. The ums, the us, the you-knows. What is the psychology behind those?
Well, what I think is fascinating here is that filler words often stem from a very, very deep-seated discomfort with silence. It's almost as if our brains are wired to fill any gap in conversation, even if it's with sounds that don't actually have any meaning, while we're trying to formulate that next sentence. But the research indicates that while we might feel like they're buying us time, they actually dilute our message. And for you as a listener, these fillers can be distracting and sometimes even make the speaker sound less sure of what they're saying.
So the first step for anyone looking to kind of, cut down on these is simply to become aware of when and how often they're using them. And the material suggests a pretty straightforward way to do that.
Yes, self-awareness is absolutely key. And the simple recommendation to record yourself speaking, whether it's practice for a presentation or just a casual conversation with a friend, and then listening back with a critical ear is so incredibly valuable. This allows you to pinpoint your own filler word tendencies. Are you an enthusiast, a frequent user of like, or perhaps is your go-to? Once you have that awareness, you can start to very consciously work on replacing those fillers.
Right, and so, the goal isn't to suddenly speak at, lightning speed or to feel panicked by a moment of silence.
Right.
What is the alternative here?
Exactly. I think the alternative, and often the more powerful choice, is to replace those filler words with a brief, confident pause. Just think of it as a punctuation mark in your speech. A short silence can signal to your listener that you are collecting your thoughts deliberately rather than being uncertain or scrambling for words. It's also really important to plan your transitions between ideas. If you know how you're going to move from one point to the next, you're less likely to get caught in that mental gap where filler words tend to creep in.
Now, this is something I thought was really interesting. The material talks about the difference between fluency and flow. And those might seem interchangeable, but there's a really important distinction there.
There is. Linguistic fluency generally refers to your overall command of language, your knowledge of grammar, vocabulary, and ability to express yourself, accurately. Verbal flow, on the other hand, is about the smoothness and continuity of your speech. And you could have excellent grammar and a wide-ranging vocabulary. You could be very fluent but still struggle with flow if your speech is punctuated by frequent stops and starts and hesitations.
So having a good grasp of the language is certainly important, but our focus today is really on helping people achieve that smooth, uninterrupted delivery, that verbal flow that makes your communications so much more engaging and impactful.
Precisely. And the sources you shared provided some really concrete, actionable techniques that listeners can start using right away to build that continuous speaking flow. Let's delve into some of those practical strategies.
Okay, great. The first technique they highlight is called thought linking. Can you explain what that is and how it works?
Sure. Thought linking involves consciously using specific phrases to create smoother connections between your ideas. For example, the material mentions things like, "That's why I believe." Another point to consider is, what I find interesting is, and let me add to that by saying, and these are incredibly valuable tools for you. They act as verbal bridges, maintaining the momentum of your conversation, while giving your brain just a fraction of a second to organize your next thought without creating that noticeable gap. They also signal to your listener that your ideas are connected, and you're moving logically from one point to the next. And interestingly, these phrases can also help you structure your own thinking in real time.
That makes a lot of sense. It's almost like giving yourself little verbal signposts to kind of guide you as you go. The next technique they mentioned is called thinking out loud. Now, that sounds a little bit counterintuitive.
It might seem that way, but the core idea behind thinking out loud is to verbalize your thought process as it's happening. So you're using phrases like, "Let me explain how I see this," or "I'm thinking about this in a few different ways," can be surprisingly effective. It essentially trains your brain to articulate its thoughts in real time. Even if your initial phrasing isn't perfectly polished, the very act of speaking your thoughts helps to maintain that verbal momentum and makes a complete stop less likely. It's about letting your listener hear the gears turning, so to speak.
So less about, waiting for that perfectly formed thought to emerge, and more about articulating as it's taking shape.
Very interesting. The material also mentions the value of structured speaking patterns. How can having a structure actually help with flow? Well, structured speaking patterns provide a predefined framework for organizing your thoughts before you even open your mouth to speak. So a simple structure like introduction, then reason, then example, and then conclusion can be very powerful for you. By having this mental outline, even a basic one, you significantly reduce the chances of getting lost mid-sentence or experiencing those awkward blank pauses while you're trying to figure out what to say next. It's like having a mental roadmap to follow.
Yeah, almost like training wheels for your thoughts. Okay, so the next one here is a little more active. Visual prompts. Tell me about that.
Yeah, this is a really practical exercise that encourages you to speak continuously and build your descriptive language skills. The idea is simple. You pick a random object or maybe an image and then describe it out loud for maybe 1 or 2 minutes. This forces you to find words, think on your feet, and keep speaking. You're not relying on pre-planned ideas or arguments. It's excellent practice for expanding your vocabulary and improving your ability to articulate your observations fluently. You might be surprised at how much you can say about a simple object when you really focus on it.
I like that. Now, the last one here is called the flow pacing drill. This one sounds intense.
It is a more focused exercise. It's specifically designed to help you break the habit of pausing unnecessarily. So you set a timer typically for 2 minutes. Choose a topic, something you know reasonably well, and then you speak continuously on that topic. Now here's the key. If you find yourself getting stuck and wanting to go silent instead of doing that, you repeat the last word you said until a new thought emerges. And this might feel a little strange at first, but it forces you to maintain verbal momentum, and it helps to train your brain to keep generating speech. The topics like travel or hobbies are good starting points because you likely have a lot to say about them.
Okay, these all sound incredibly useful. In fact, the material suggests we try a little guided speaking exercise right now.
Exactly. Let's put some of these principles into immediate practice. I'm going to give you a couple topics, and for a short duration, just try to speak continuously on each. Don't worry at all about being perfect or saying the right thing. The main goal is simply to keep the flow of speech going. How about we start with something pretty familiar? My ideal morning routine. Just speak whatever comes to mind, focusing on keeping those words flowing.
Okay, so my ideal morning routine. Let me think. Definitely waking up naturally. Absolutely no alarm clocks. Maybe some birds chirping outside my window. And the smell of coffee brewing. A nice cup of coffee. Some quiet time to myself. Maybe doing a little bit of yoga or stretching. Just easing into the day. And definitely a healthy breakfast, no rushing around. And maybe a little bit of reading or listening to some music, just setting a calm and positive tone for the day.
Excellent. Notice how even when you were perhaps formulating the next detail in your mind, the flow of your speech continued. Now let's try one more, and again, just focus on keeping that continuous stream of words going. How about a place I want to visit?
Okay, a place I want to visit. Let's see. I've always been fascinated by the idea of going to Iceland. I picture these dramatic landscapes with glaciers and volcanoes and waterfalls and those incredible northern lights. Maybe hiking through some of those amazing natural wonders, soaking in a geothermal hot spring, exploring the unique culture and the food. I've heard they have amazing seafood. Even just the idea of being in that vast open landscape with fresh air and incredible views. Yeah, that would be a truly memorable trip.
Wonderful. As you can probably hear, even with just a little bit of focused effort, maintaining that continuous stream of speech is absolutely achievable. And the material emphasizes that regular practice of exercises like this builds what they call verbal stamina, like training for any kind of endurance activity. The more you practice, the stronger and more sustained your ability becomes.
I like that analogy. So it's not just about trying to fill silence with random noise, but about actively training our brains to keep generating and expressing our thoughts verbally in a more continuous way. Now, another key strategy that the material emphasizes is this idea of training the brain for sentence thinking. Can you explain what that means and why it's beneficial for flow?
Yeah, this represents a fundamental shift in how you process language when you're about to speak. So instead of thinking in individual words and then trying to string them together into a sentence as you go, the goal is to start thinking in complete sentences from the outset. And this pre-planning at the sentence level can significantly reduce those little pauses and hesitations that often occur when you're figuring out the grammatical structure.
And what are some ways that people can actively train their brain to kind of operate at that sentence level?
Well, there are several effective exercises. Reading simple sentences aloud can help you internalize the natural rhythm and structure of spoken sentences. Writing short paragraphs on different topics and then speaking them aloud reinforces the connection between written and spoken language at that complete sentence level. A really accessible exercise is to simply describe your immediate surroundings in complete sentences. For example, you could say, "The sun is shining brightly outside the window. The room I'm in feels very quiet and peaceful. I'm currently sitting on a comfortable chair." This helps you practice forming sentences spontaneously. And finally, watching short clips of videos and then immediately trying to describe what you saw and heard in full sentences can really help as well.
Those are some really great tips. And, speaking of tips, the material actually lays out a suggested daily practice routine for building speaking flow. Can you walk us through that routine?
Absolutely. The proposed routine is designed to be concise and yet comprehensive. It includes dedicating just 2 minutes to self-talk, where you simply speak your thoughts aloud on any topic that comes to mind. Then 2 minutes of object description, putting those visual prompt skills into practice. Following that 2 minutes of story retelling, which helps to build your narrative flow and ability to connect ideas. Next 2 minutes specifically focused on practicing those crucial link phrases we talked about earlier, consciously incorporating them into your speech. And finally, 2 minutes dedicated to filler word elimination, where you actively try to replace ums and ums with brief, deliberate pauses.
I love that. It's only 10 minutes. It sounds very manageable, even for the busiest schedules. And they really emphasize that even those short, consistent practice sessions can lead to some really, significant improvement over time.
Exactly. That's the remarkable power of compounding small, consistent habits. By dedicating even just a few minutes each day to these focused exercises, you can actually begin to rewire your brain and strengthen those neural pathways that support smoother, more fluid speech. It's not about overnight transformation, but about steady, incremental progress.
I love that. Now, finally, the material touches on something they call a real-world mindset shift, which I thought was a very interesting way to put it. It reminds us that even the most polished and fluent speakers aren't perfect. And the key is often simply to keep speaking and to not get overly fixated on those minor stumbles.
This is such a crucial point. The pursuit of absolute perfection in your speech can actually be a major contributor to pauses and hesitation. The reality is that effective communication is primarily about conveying your ideas and connecting with others. Minor stumbles, occasional ums, or slightly awkward phrasing are perfectly natural parts of human conversation. The key is to keep going, maintain that overall flow, and focus on expressing yourself clearly and authentically.
So the advice is to actively look for opportunities to practice in a variety of everyday situations. whether it's at work, at home, with family, or even just ordering your coffee, as a way to build your confidence through consistent action. The more you put yourself out there and focus on flow, the more natural and fluid it will become over time.
Precisely. It's about building that fundamental comfort level with speaking continuously without getting overly self-conscious or hung up on minor errors. As the source material aptly puts it, focusing on the flow can often help you overcome the fear of speaking imperfectly. Speaking is a skill that, like any other, is honed through consistent practice, and confidence naturally grows as you take action and see tangible improvements.
This has been such a great deep dive into the art of speaking without those unnecessary pauses. And it's really clear that while, some might perceive it as an innate talent, it's actually a collection of skills that can be systematically developed through practice and by consistently practicing these techniques. So as we wrap up here, the core message really is prioritize flow over perfect fluency. Recognize that speaking is a skill that improves with practice, and understand that genuine confidence arises from action.
And I think what's particularly interesting is how interconnected all of these ideas are. By actively focusing on building your speaking flow, you'll likely find that you naturally reduce your anxiety around speaking and build greater confidence, which in turn reinforces those smoother, more fluid speaking habits. It's a really positive cycle.
Absolutely. And on that note, here's something for everyone listening to think about this week. Think about one specific situation that you know is coming up in the next few days. It could be a meeting at work, a conversation with a friend, or even just ordering your coffee. And challenge yourself to consciously apply just one of the techniques we discussed today. Maybe it's intentionally using a linking phrase to bridge 2 points, or trying the think out loud approach when explaining something, or simply focusing on being more aware of those filler words and replacing them with a pause. See what difference that small focused application makes, not just in your communication, but also in your overall confidence as you move forward. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.